Can you guys see a slide that says hello? Fantastic. Not my name is Fadi. Okay, good. You can't see my presenter notes. So hello, my name is Fadi. Hope everyone's all right. Like Rebecca said, I'm here to talk to you about breaking down the brief. She already sort of mentioned a little bit about who I am, but I'll reinforce it, I suppose. Fadi Dada, and there's no real correct way to pronounce my surname. Dada, 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 like it doesn't matter. Say it however you want. Dada, Dada, Dada. Honestly, it's up for grabs. The name, like me, is Syrian. Ahlan sahlan to any Arabs on the call. I grew up in Derby, so A up to anyone from the East Midlands on the call, and obviously welcome everyone else. You're all welcome here. But I suppose the crux of why I'm here to talk to you is this. I work for Anomaly London, and I spend my days writing and solving strategies for some of the biggest brands in the world, which I really love doing. And I guess more importantly, like Rebecca mentioned, I've judged D&AD New Blood for a while. Over the last 3 years, I was a jury president on one of those occasions, which was a real honour. I got to award some pencils to some really incredible New Blood work over the years. And actually, I'd encourage all of you to go to the website, the New Blood website, and check out the winners from the previous years, because everything you need to put together a successful entry is contained in those case studies. Like, you should look at the yellow pencils. You'll spot the similarities pretty quickly. But I suppose for every one of those pencil-winning case studies, there's hundreds and hundreds of submissions that didn't even make it past the first round of voting. And I think there's plenty of lessons to be learnt there too. So that's what I'm going to do today. I'm here to share some of those lessons with you. And I started by collecting feedback from other judges about the work and what did and didn't make it. And I guess there was a few themes. Originality was one. Lacking an original idea or a core human insight. So many duplicate ideas. Mostly will sort of partner with X. That we'll talk about that later. But the idea being we'll partner with Spotify. That's not an idea. Unoriginal ideas. A few had the same idea and didn't dig deeper. The second part of my presentation, I'll give you some tips for digging deeper and how to sort of push past once you've broken down the brief and you've understood it. But I suppose one of the main themes that came through was that the work wasn't on brief, misread or ignored parts of the brief, work that didn't answer or felt inappropriate to the brief, didn't tick all the boxes for the brief, not fit for the brief, when it was too abstract and strayed too far away from the original brief. So, before I get into it, it's not actually all that surprising that entries struggle on this front. New Blood briefs are really difficult. They're a client brief, not an agency brief, or they're somewhere in between the two, really. With an agency brief, you usually get a strategist like me who would give you a clear creative strategy to execute. With New Blood, you kind of have to be strategist and creative at the same time, which is a tough ask. You have to break down the brief to its core components and make strategic choices, I guess, on how to best solve it creatively. It's a tall order, but a pencil is a really prestigious thing, and it's worth the effort. So for those who take the time to sort of really think about the brief, break it down and solve it strategically, the reward is really high. Original strategies get you to original ideas, and that will put you above 90% of all the entries, so it's really worth doing. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about, breaking down the brief. They're actually quite concisely written, despite sort of being, and I've shamelessly put the one I wrote on here. They're usually a page. All the information you need is right there. But there are times in my career where I've received briefs that are dense, unclear, hard to take in, sort of hundreds of pages, no real sort of narrative or story. And I, over the years, have found that asking myself these 5 questions really helps me make sure I've pulled out all the important information before, I start making choices. And so I'm going to share them with you. 5 questions to ask yourself when receiving a brief. And the first one is, what is the problem we're trying to solve? And this is often the most overlooked parts of answering a brief, understanding and defining the problem. This clever clogs once said, if I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about the solution. That's because putting a clear problem at the top of everything you do gives you focus. It gives you a clear enemy and something to respond to. And briefs don't always spell out problems. Actually, clients can be quite allergic to that sometimes. They want to sort of couch everything in very positive language. They might say things like, we want you to connect the brand to a new audience, or we need existing users to use the product more or do things differently. Each of those sort of wants has a problem behind it. And I think if you spend a bit of time thinking about what that problem could be, it's going to help you. It's going to help you a lot. It's going to get you to an original place. So take the context from the brief and ask yourself some questions to sort of try and get you to sort of that original problem from which you can hang everything on. What do people think about the brand? Do people understand the product? Do people think about the product in a way that isn't helpful? What's happening in the world around the brand, and is that having an impact? That's usually quite an interesting one to ask. Ask your friends, ask your family, dig deep. If you can find an original angle to the problem, everything you do next will be all the better for it. But then remember, always link it back to the brief. Show the judges you've actually taken the information that's been presented to you and help them see how you've interpreted it. That's a big part of it, actually, just helping people see your thinking. So you told us X, but we think the real problem is Y. Could be one way you do it. Just like a little semantic language thing that helps you sort of show you've listened, but actually then show the leap you've taken. To do X, the brief, we've got to address Y, the problem. If we're going to X, Y needs to change. You can see what I'm trying to do. Right. Next question to ask yourself from the 5 is, who are we talking to? Again, really important. I've noticed a trend among a lot of the new blood entries to assume that Gen Z is always the audience, even when it hasn't been called for. So read the brief, highlight any clues in there about the type of person you're talking to. They won't always say we're trying to talk to this audience or that audience. It might be quite broad. But if you can look for the clues and you can kind of think about the type of person you're talking to, things they might have in common, even if it isn't age or gender. And like, just a few examples from the real world. This ad does a really good job at talking to people who don't want to be defined by IKEA, couples that don't want to be their relationship or the kind of the canvas of their relationship, their flat, to be defined by IKEA. Prove you're not boring. No Swedish meatballs, no instructions, no divorce. You're better than flat pack. You can only get to this level of creativity and fun if you actually if you really understand who your audience is and who you're writing for. When you write for mass, you can do that. And that can get you to some good places, but it's a lot harder to sort of write stuff that's clever, witty, playful when you're trying to do it for everyone. People have different tastes. This is a really lovely creative example of how you can talk to people who maybe struggle to open up. I don't know if people saw this. It was made by Norwich City. I think the whole thing is quite long. I'll play a little bit of it. I think I forgot to share with sound. Exposed myself again. I'll tell you what, I'll get these videos shared as a link after the presentation. It's really good. I don't want to say much about it because there's a sort of a twist in it. And then this is maybe sort of more of a mass example, I guess. People who eat food and go places. Like, everyone eats food and goes places. This is a really interesting campaign. I love how underwritten it is, and almost in how underwritten and under art directed it is, it gets to sort of this really lovely tone that sort of invites everyone in. So it does things in a sort of slightly different way. And then another question to ask yourself: what would you like them to think? So you know your problem, you have a handle on who you're talking to. Now think about what you want them to think. If you did your job perfectly, what would the audience take away from the communication? Do we need them to see our brand in a new light? Are we trying to change their mind about something, or getting them to connect with our product, sort of connect it to their life somehow? What's the persuasive argument for getting them to think that way? This is often something that people forget to sort of do. They just kind of say a thing and it doesn't really sort of show the judge how you've kind of you've understood a problem, and then how you're trying to be persuasive. A lot of what we're doing in this industry is trying to be persuasive. And if you've clearly defined the problem, this part should be easy. The problem is X, the solve is Y. And, like, again, just some interesting examples from the world that I think have a good solve for problems. There's a sexual taboo surrounding people who go through cancer treatments. So show that everyone deserves to feel desired, worthy, and happy of a healthy sex life. This was a recent example that went out into the world that I really love. The world has changed since Warburton started baking bread in 1876. And even though there's a lot of choice, everyone is pretending to be Warburtons, yellow, orange packaging, sort of similar sort of style. We need people to know that not all bread is created equal. Really fun solve. The ad with Samuel L. Jackson in it is also really fun. So, next question to ask yourself. We have a problem. We know who we're going to talk to and what we want them to think. But what do we actually want them to do? What's the call to action? And again, this is almost the part that people really hate, especially even seasoned advertising creatives who sometimes want to pretend that they don't work in advertising. The bit where you're actually making the sale, the bit where you're actually sort of saying to people, do a thing. Really important. So what's the call to action? And typically, this isn't a definitive list. This is something I cobble together, but like typically this covers it. Buy a thing, love a thing, hate a thing, sign a thing, support a thing, remember a thing, change their mind about a thing. Like, generally speaking, that's what we're trying to get people to do. And it's usually that. Like, let's be truthful. It's usually that. It can sometimes be that plus one of these, maybe. We want people to buy us, so we want to be front of mind and remember us. We want them to sort of change their mind about us. They don't, but essentially buy us. I've noticed with new blood briefs, people can sometimes make it this, even when it isn't that. Support a thing. If you're going to introduce some kind of higher purpose, cause or charity, fine, but make sure you've got a really good reason to do it, and that it links flawlessly back to the main brief and your brand. If you can't tell people to support the cause that you're trying to insert into the brief, and buy your brand in the same sentence, you probably shouldn't be doing it. And I've noticed a lot of the time that, I don't know, there'll be a brief set about get people to buy more soap, and some cause will come in, and you never see the sort of the product and the cause in the same slide, because I guess the person at some point realizes, it's kind of icky, like it's kind of cynical. I think it can be a really nice way to solve a brief, attaching the brand to a cause that kind of it has a natural sort of affinity and relationship to, but it can come across as cynical, it can come across as crass, and it can kind of really have this effect on your entry where it starts to become very bitty and not kind of, it doesn't all live together, because you have to start segmenting things. So think carefully if you're going to make it that. And finally, question 5, where are we talking to them? Most new blood briefs ask you to think about a variety of channels. And again, a big thing that many miss, I suppose, they make it one execution and forget about the rest, if an ad or a billboard or something, or they put the same execution, a film sometimes, in lots of different channels without much thought about sort of how you're playing into the characteristics of the channel or the media placement. And it's a really good opportunity to sort of really prove to the judges that you have a big idea, because a big idea can live in lots of different places. It can be expressed in different ways, because it's kind of the thing in the middle. And then if your idea isn't an execution, i.e. we're going to partner with X or we're going to do that, it should be able to flex. And I think you can score big points by using the where and the how your idea shows up to sort of reinforce the main thing you want people to take away. Like calling attention to the fact that your crisps are made from British potatoes by creating a crop vert in a potato field. Crop vert is their word, not mine. Although I do like a pun, so fine. Got them a lot of coverage, and it's, you can see it's really linking their product to the source and sort of turning it into a key visual. It, like the placement where it shows up, helps reinforce the message. And you know you've established your sort of authentic potato creds when Potato News Today gives you a shout out. So good job, Walkers. Or maybe you want people to remember you when they're hungover, or instinctively know that Domino's is always a phone call away, always possible. This was Domino's sort of delivering stuff to campers at Glastonbury. Stunty in the first instance, you might think, oh, it's just a bit random. They're just trying to grab PR, but I think they're trying to reinforce the occasion of Domino's, reinforce sort of how easy the delivery is, and they're using this kind of setting of a festival when maybe some of those triggers are very present to reinforce that connection with people. Or if people are stuck in the past when it comes to their opinions about you, maybe you can use the past to tell them that you're wrong. Mackie D's. Oh, I think this will play. Again, no sound. This will go out on the link afterwards. There's like a corny 90s track over the top of this. Mackie D's ran this sort of 30-second teletext inspired ad. I guess a lot of you maybe don't even know what teletext is. I was young when this was a thing. You used to sort of just go onto it on your TV, this kind of analog text thing. And so we've been using 100% British and Irish brief since you were booking your holidays here. Just a really clever way to get people sort of using the iconography of the past to get people to think about the present. And then I want to surface this quickly as an example of an ad that does an idea that does multi-channel really well. So during the COVID lockdowns, and remember it was during the COVID lockdowns, that moment in time where we've tried to forget existed, when we were all sort of trapped in our houses. Tourism Iceland, for the country Iceland, launched this campaign which basically invited people to scream into their computers and phones. They sort of launched it through the site, and then they released those screams into the wild, which was really fun, and put it all in this sort of incredible TV ad, which is just sort of a kind of quite a fun montage of sort of people sort of screaming and generally losing their mind and feeling kind of how we felt in that moment. I'm going to stop playing that one there. Again, it will go out after the talk. Got them a ton of coverage, all the press, and not just industry press. A lot of the time advertising ideas do very well with industry press and industry types, but this actually was mainstream, sort of all the big ones. And I think it was because it was a simple idea that played off a really clear insight. Think back to lockdown. Sorry, but all our daily interactions were sort of reduced to these kind of hyper close-ups of faces on computers, a bit like me now. And it was enough to make anyone feel claustrophobic. And so I guess the idea is sort of really clear with this one. With its gorgeous open spaces, Iceland is the place they should go to let it all out when travel comes back. A great idea, expressed beautifully and flexibly across a lot of channels. So a good case study to look at. So a recap on those questions. What is the problem we're trying to solve? Who are we talking to? What would we like them to think? What would we like them to do? Where are we talking to them? If you've answered all those questions, chances are you're going to be on brief. You've got loads of pieces there. How you put them together is up to you. How much further you dig is up to you, but that's a really good starting point. I'm going to talk a little bit about, there's going to be a Bella talk later with a chap called Pedro, creative director, who I think is going to sort of talk about digging deeper with ideas more generally. But I think just want to spend a little bit of time on the originality part of what we heard, because it's a really important part to making sure you're kind of not only understanding the brief, but answering it well and answering it in a way that's going to stand out from the rest. Because my advice would be to keep pushing. Take those answers as a starting point. Do some research and find your insights. Insights are gold in a sea of, do I want to say fool's gold? I don't know. I've gone with this analogy. Let's double down on it. Most people will hold up the fool's gold. It's the first assumption they make about the brief, the first thing that pops into their head, and a lot of the time they just can't push past it. And I see this with people who are professionals. It takes a lot of discipline to let your early idea go. You know, that first thing that pops into your head that makes you smile and makes you think you've understood the brief. It can be quite, it can take a lot to walk away from that, because like it gave you all the endorphins and made you feel good about yourself. But trust me, let the fool's gold go and keep pushing, because if it came to you in the first 10 seconds or, you know, very close to when you read the brief, chances are it popped into the heads of a lot of other people, unless you've just got one of those wild brains that instantly makes lateral connections. Most of us need to kind of really push to sort of get to sort of something that's interesting, novel, and natural. I just want to sort of talk about this example really quickly. Here's some research I did to answer an Expedia brief I worked on. I was curious about what people wanted to do when Expedia are a travel company, you book your holidays through them. I was curious about what people wanted to do on holiday and the reason they wanted to travel. So I went through, and the same theme kept coming up again and again. They wanted to be unproductive. They wanted to prioritize mental health. They wanted to switch off and relax. Some stats here to sort of, I went to sort of trend reports and sort of surveys that had been put together on travel. Noticed that despite that, a lot of people were taking their laptops on holiday, which is wild, and taking work meetings and Zoom calls, and that they were feeling burnt out and that holidays generally weren't helping. And that got me curious, like, why is it really hard, even though you know you want to do nothing, why can't you switch off? And I found this study, which was kind of the unlock, a study where it details how across 11 different research studies, researchers found that participants would rather do anything, even administer themselves with electric shocks, rather than doing nothing. So that was all kind of fascinating, and like you had kind of the clues here. I could have taken any one of these and just used that to sort of write the whole brief. You know, people are taking their laptops on holiday, or, you know, people are just switching off or can't switch off. But sort of putting them all together, you get to give this kind of insight. It's not flawless, but, you know, it was a more original starting point than any of the left, or kind of even just having not done this work at all. We're more burnt out than ever, yet we've completely forgotten how to just turn off and be. And it was an insight that led to a really sort of go, again, it won't play well, but like it's Ewan McGregor in his silky dulcet tones, waxing lyrical about the powers of doing nothing when you go away. I really love this film. It's all locked off shots. It's very still. It's very peaceful. It's a shame you can't hear it. But there was sort of other components to this campaign which I really loved. We sort of made a commitment to turn up in really busy, worky districts, and just remind people to switch off and do nothing. Go where you have nowhere to be. This is, I forget which North American city this is, just some working part of town. You've got so much nothing to do, intercepting people on their commutes. Go somewhere emails can't, which I really love as a line. And then ask yourself more questions. I guess one of the takeaways from my talk is just like ask yourself loads of questions. Maybe that's really obvious. Maybe you didn't need to listen to me talk for an hour to get there, but hopefully these are helpful. These are questions that I think really help you sort of get to some interesting insights and ideas. Ask yourself who the enemy is. For Android to win, Apple must lose. Like if you're kind of working on an Android brief, like that is a really interesting way into it. So what are Apple's weaknesses? How would Apple lose? Like you're instantly framing the way you solve the brief in a much more interesting way than if you kind of like, oh, what's great about Android? You could ask yourself who would never be seen dead with our brand. So I don't know, if you're working on a Facebook brief, Gen Z think that Facebook is boring and for people in their 40s and 50s. Maybe they don't. I don't know. Maybe that's changed. So what needs to change? That could be another interesting way into sort of solving a brief. What if we changed the category we play in? This is a very underused one, but I think can be really effective. So think about water, for example. Pure, healthy, natural, wholesome water. Sold in plastic bottles and going into landfill, but that's another issue. It's always marketed this way. So like to liquid death. This is also water. But they've obviously looked at energy drinks and maybe a little bit booze and taken a lot of the codes of that category to disrupt this nonsense. And they've done it so well. It's so standout. Another good case study to sort of check out. They do lots of great things. And what weird stuff do we know about our audience is another great question to ask. Like, once you've sort of established who you're talking to, try and get to something that's beyond, I don't know, like an age or a Gen Z or millennials or whatever. Like, it can be nice to be really specific. The thing on the left here is something that we at Anomaly sort of made for Mini. Like, we realized that a lot of people just really love the sound of peeling plastic off a new car, so we created this like ASMR thing, and it did so well. Like, it was just simply a video of like peeling plastic, and really sort of good sound. And the Mini community on social just went wild for it. And Marmite being another great example. These McDonald's ads in the middle, actually mainstream populist work, but I think had people's quirks at their heart, like this person eating the burger with a knife and fork. So weird. Like, who would eat the burger like that? And then this other person, I think we can all relate to this, when you've got the burger home and you've kind of, a friend of mine once said it's like you're contaminating it, because he's not a fan. He's like, you should eat the burger as it comes. Whereas no, I'm going to put crisps in it. And then what would be the absolute wrong thing to do can sometimes get you to some really interesting ideas. So you've probably all seen this moldy burger at this point. I'm not a huge fan of it, but in the category that always shows their product pristine, like showing the product like this is not something that it would be the first sort of response to the brief. And it does reinforce the fact that there are no artificial preservatives in it. Whether you want to show your product as molding, different question, but that's not what we're here to talk about today. Removing the brand, in the case of Doritos and the campaign they did there, or just telling people to delete your app, can get you some really interesting sort of lines and places. Or, if you're Patagonia, telling people to not buy this jacket. I mean, it's obvious what they're doing here. They're a sustainable, environmentally conscious brand, and they could have easily taken this moment, I think this was sort of in line with World Environment Day, to sort of Black Friday, to sort of run a headline that was like, consumerism is bad, in the round, or our products are really sustainable. But they put out quite a provocative headline: don't buy our jacket, don't buy this jacket. And in telling people not to buy them, they really reinforce the thing that they actually want you to remember about them, that they take this stuff really seriously, and you're more likely to buy them year round anyway, because you have this sort of perception of them. So those questions again: who is our enemy? Who would never be seen dead of our brand? What if we change the category we played in? What weird stuff do we know about our audience? And what would be the absolute wrong thing to do? And then put it all together. And like, how you put it together, that comes down to you, I suppose. And the kind of entry you're working on, your style, the way you want to sort of tell a story, but remember to tell a story. I have a suggestion here for like a way of putting it all together in a way that kind of makes sense, that shows you've kind of read the brief, you've understood the brief, and sort of shows your thinking. Don't take this as gospel, or don't sort of use it as just use it as a starting point. But if it was me, I'd start, your brief asked us to X, sort of recap it, show them you've read it, show them you've understood it. But the problem is, insert the problem you come up with, tell them sort of what you're going to solve, tell them how it relates to the brief that's been set. And that's because insight, and that can come, that's the new way of seeing the world. That's from understanding your audience, or sort of a way into the idea. So we're going to tell them your idea. Simple statement, not executional, should read as a solve to the problem. So if your idea reads as, we're going to partner with Spotify, you've messed up. A lot of the time, and that's just another quick takeaway, if your idea is, we're going to partner with X, or we're going to partner with Y, whatever your reasons, that's not the idea. The idea sits above that. That's an execution. And I think just getting clear about what the idea is, and then how you're going to execute the idea, is really important. And then create the work, make sure it shows up in a variety of channels, and it has a clear message, and importantly, a call to action. because it is advertising or branding, or it is you're doing it for a reason. So just make sure you show the judges you've understood what that reason is. I think that's everything.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Fadi. There's lots of good tips in there for you guys. So I hope you found that really useful. So we're now going to move over into Q&A section. So we've got the Q&A function. So if you've got any questions you'd like to ask Fadi, please do pop them in and we'll work our way through them. So I guess one of the questions that we've got through is, how do we know if it's an observation or an insight?
I think the honest answer to that is you don't. I think there's a lot of people sort of on sort of strategy Twitter or strategy LinkedIn who kind of like tell you the distinction matters. I think it's just got to excite you. It needs to feel a little bit original. There probably needs to be a leap in it. It needs to have like a tension in it, I suppose. An insight is people think X, but actually it's Y, or yet, or however. Like, these are words that are generally found in an insight. It's kind of like you understand the world in one way, but actually this is going on here. There was an insight that I used sort of on a road safety campaign I worked on years ago. That was studies found that most people understand that road traffic accidents are caused by human error. Like, they all instinctively get that. But the majority think they're immune. Like, that's really interesting psychology. So people understand people cause them and human sort of mistakes cause them, but they think they're above it. And that takes it to an insight. Like, those two things on their own are kind of observations. Putting them together like that is an insight. But I will just also add, sometimes observations can be all it takes to unlock a brief. Like, if it's an interesting observation or a truth, I think sort of I wouldn't sort of sit there worrying sort of about dogmatically about what's my insight. I'd just be like, think about those pieces. Think about, have you sort of understood the brief, taken sort of the information you need, and then put it together in an interesting and novel way, and pushed into a space where other entries are unlikely to go. How you get there is almost by the by. But for me, that's the distinction between an insight and an observation. Others might tell you different.
Perfect, thank you. Next question. Thanks, Fadi, for the amazing presentation. What would you say is a good starting point to finding insights? If you're approaching any one of these briefs, what type of research would you consider your starting off point?
Yeah, it's a good question. I showed you the example where I went to a lot of studies and sort of trend reports and things like that. That's one way of doing it. It's not the only way. It's a good start. Google is your friend. Like, if whatever territory you're in, trying to, and like, make sure it's recent too. Some briefs might be okay with stuff that's more historic, but generally speaking, you want to sort of search for stuff within the last year, search for research, find trend reports. That's a good starting point because it helps ground you in the thing you're in. And I always do a bit of desk research before I get going. But then, depending on the brief, I worked on a football brief for a brand a few years ago. And the way I got to all the insights was actually, football's emotional. And it wasn't sort of sitting at my computer. It was actually going to speak to fans. And actually, it was all the little turns of phrases that people said when they were talking about why they support the club. That was the stuff that ended up being pulled out and used to inform the work. So it can be talking to people. It can be, I don't know, like, I work with a strategist who says her starting point is always Mumsnet, like going into forums and sort of seeing what people are saying to each other when they think no one else is, like, when they think advertisers like us aren't listening. Trying to sort of listen to conversations, walking around in the world with your headphones off sometimes and actually sort of listening to what's happening around you can be good. If going to the place where your brand or product exists and just watching people interact with it. I know a lot of strategists who work on FMCG brands. Sounds a bit creepy, but they go into the supermarket and they're kind of watching people sort of like look at the shelf and what they pick up and why they pick it up. So there's all sorts of ways. Curiosity, I guess, is the simple, too long didn't read answer.
Great, some really good tips there. Next question. So if the target audience is specified, so for example, 18 to 30, are we supposed to keep that target audience broad at 18 to 30, or can we pick a specific audience within that? If we pick a specific audience within that, would that mean that we're not properly answering the brief?
No, you should absolutely pick a specific audience within that, but you should say why. You should have a really strong justification, and you shouldn't assume that the judges are going to understand why you've done it. So if you decide that you're going to actually, the key to answering this brief is to, you've told us 18 to 45, but really we've noticed that these specific people are the people you need to win. Just make sure you kind of take the judges on that journey. Because actually, taking that for me shows that you've really thought about it and you've understood the problem, and there's probably some interesting rationale as to why you've made that choice there. But just make sure you share that rationale. I would encourage that sort of thing. Like I say, I think the more sort of targeted you can be around who you're talking to, the better the output is going to be. I just think it's going to be more interesting. So yeah, I'd say make sure you say why you've made that choice, and then I guess be really tough with yourself before you submit and when you're reviewing the creative. Like, has that focus helped? Is your idea better for it? Have you got to something that's interesting and original? Or have you kind of just done it for the sake of it? And if you kind of addressed the broader audience, would the work be there and thereabouts the same? I think you've just got to be really honest with yourself. But it is something I would personally encourage.
Amazing, thank you. And how important would you say it is to stick to the brief, and how far can you kind of push it?
You can push it as far as you want to push it. I think it's just very obvious when someone is answering the brief they want to answer, rather than solving the problem. So I think as long as you kind of do that first bit where it's like, you've asked us to do X, but the real problem is Y. What you do next is kind of up to you, if you can sort of tell a logical story. I often find though that people, and the judges see through it, they gravitate towards certain new blood entries, and then they just kind of submit the idea they had in their head, and it's usually an executional idea, usually with whatever sort of the hot thing is at that moment, whether it was the metaverse, or I imagine it's going to be the same for AI this year. And they just try and make it sort of fit in the brief, and you can kind of spot that a mile off. I think pushing beyond is a really interesting thing to do. The Duolingo brief that I judged, I can't remember which, over 3 years, I think it was maybe a couple of years ago, I really loved. That was just kind of a brief about getting people to use Duolingo more. And there was an idea in there where they targeted football fans really specifically, and they introduced a sort of a purpose. They talked about kind of language and the multicultural sort of how multicultural the Premier League is, and how many languages there are in there, and how there's a lot of hate chants on the terraces, and sort of they created this thing called Chantalingo, where it was sort of encouraging fans to sort of sing chants about players like Mohamed Salah in Arabic, which is the language I speak, and sort of addressing that issue. But I've kind of butchered it there, worth looking at the case study. But like they showed how that was addressing the original brief, and they pushed it to a place that was really far away, actually, from a lot of the entries. And you could almost look at it if you were just squinting and think, is that an answer to this brief? But like they just took us through the steps, and they just got to sort of a really novel insight, a really novel problem.
Amazing. Another question that we've got through. So a common thing I've heard in a lot of student case films is we use AI technology. How much freedom would you say we should take when it comes to technology being used in our solutions?
So using technology to create the output. If you're going to use it, ask yourself why. And then be really upfront about what you've done. if the use of AI is going to help reinforce the idea or it's a part of your story, use it. But explain and tell. You get quite a few. You can submit quite a lot of stuff with a new blood entry, and I think if you've made that creative choice, talk about why you've made it. I don't think there's any sort of anyone who sort of says to you like blanket rule yes or no. I think it's more nuanced than that. Like I think if you've just done it for the sake of doing it, probably not a good idea. If you've done it and you're kind of trying to pass it off as your own work, probably not very morally sort of scrupulous. And I imagine people will see through it. If you've done it to sort of try and make a broader point or land the idea in some way or supplement the stuff you're making and you're upfront about it, then it will just come down to how well you've executed it as to whether sort of the judges will like it or not, or how clear it is or how well reasoned it is. I'm not sure if that's a perfect answer to the question, but that would be my take on it.
Amazing, thank you. We also have a talk on technology and AI lined up for January, so keep an eye out on our socials for when we announce that. So another question we've got through is, clients aren't good at writing briefs. How can we help them give us a good brief and a problem to solve?
I would, yeah, I don't know. I think the advertising industry sort of dunks on clients a little bit too much. Sometimes clients don't write good briefs, and sometimes agencies answer briefs with 150 slides when it could have been 10. Like that, there's no sort of I wouldn't sort of make such a blanket. I've received some incredible client briefs, and I would actually say a lot of the time it's great if a client is really sort of clear-eyed on the problem and has come to you and said, here's the thing, and it's the real thing, and this is the thing to solve. I think actually a lot of the time, me as a strategist, that's how I earn my living, is actually finding the real problem. And it's how I can, I think taking a client brief, you could solve it in any number of ways, and actually sort of agreeing on what the problem is points you down the path to take. And I think it's a choice, and it's a choice that I think most agencies would love to be able to sort of make themselves and then sort of persuade the client is the right choice. And that's probably more, it's probably not in education and sort of getting clients to write better briefs. It's probably more as an agency being able to show the client why you've chosen the problem and sort of telling them why you've chosen the problem and sort of communicating your rationale in a way that's clear and persuasive. And as a client, sort of a willingness to listen and to trust the agency or sort of a creative practitioner, that they sort of have some experience and intuition in this. And it's a collaboration. Again, probably doesn't fully answer your question, but it kind of, I think the best thing is sort of just getting into a process where there's an exchange.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so specifically on New Blood, do you think conducting a focus group is a good idea, or should we rather stick to already existing research?
No, definitely do, like if you can do. I think that is, it might be superficial to say this, but I think anything that shows you've made more effort, or you've sort of taken an extra step, or you've gone out into the world, or you've lived with this brief for a little while before you've put the sort of idea to paper, is ultimately a good thing. I'd obviously be careful with kind of what you're using it for and how you're using it, like, and show that you've if you're running a focus group, show how you've interpreted it, or sort of why it was important to do. Like, don't just make it a gimmick and then never sort of talk about it ever again, or sort of not show what you gained from it. But anything you can do, Vox Pops, focus groups, sort of, I don't know, taking some footage from somewhere and sort of giving it your own interpretation, finding a quote. Like, I think these kind of, like, anything you can do that shows you've sort of done some novel research and you've spent some time with the brief is ultimately a good thing.
Brilliant. And apart from the kind of we are partnering with ideas, are there any other ideas that you've seen lots of and are bored of or think is overdone?
I say this sort of with a degree of caution, but I mentioned it slightly in the talk, and it's kind of like ideas that are kind of purposey for the sake of being purposey. I think, and by purpose, I mean kind of like attaching a societal cause to the brief, which doesn't need to be there. I think there was a phase in advertising where and it still kind of exists, but it was kind of at its peak a few years ago, where everyone working in advertising, I guess, developed crushing guilt and started inserting all these kind of purposes into their work, and then it got really sort of well awarded at Cannes, and I think that sent a signal out to sort of young creatives coming into the industry that to sort of make work that stands out and is good, you've got to sort of, and to clarify, I just think sometimes it's done really clumsily, or sometimes it just takes for work too far away off brief. It can be a bit cynical. As someone who actually cares about a lot of the sort of the causes that are sort of generally inserted into brief, particularly say something like the environment or human rights, it can just feel a bit disingenuous when you're sort of attaching that to, I don't know, crisps. So if you're going to do that, know that there's going to be a lot of other people doing that, and just think about kind of why you're doing it, and if there is actually sort of a really clear and logical reason. Like in the case of that Duolingo one, football players, chants, language, Duolingo encouraging sort of multinational chant. You can say Duolingo and the kind of the thing in the same sentence and not feel all icky. It makes sense. So that would be one, and then like Rebecca mentioned, there will be a session on it. So I won't sort of go into much detail, but just kind of like using Fad technology, the metaverse or AI or whatever the flavor of the month is at that particular time for the sake of it is probably something that there's always a lot of. And yeah, partnerships. Netflix partnerships, Spotify partnerships, Vice partnerships, partnerships of other brands, collabs. Yes, you might probably get to one that's interesting and no one's thought of before. Chances are you won't. Challenge accepted, I guess, if that's you and you want to sort of make your brief a partnership brief. But even if you do that, it can be kind of a nice component to the submission. Just don't make it the idea. I think just remember the hierarchy, have the idea that sits before execution, the solve. And then if one of the channels you pick, you might have a film, you might have some posters, you might do something on social or PR, something you do might be a partnership, but just don't make it the whole thing.
Brilliant, thank you. And obviously you've judged New Blood Awards before. What would you say is the most important thing you look for when judging the work?
Originality, I suppose, which we talked about a bit. The first round of voting, you get all the entries, and you've just got to sort of get you into sort of the mindset of a judge. I tend to sort of, you get given a portal and there's hundreds of entries, and you're going through them all sort of in you sit down a few times, but it's going to take you a few hours. You're looking at them back to back. And generally speaking, I'll take a look at everything first before I cast my vote. And I'm going through, and stuff that just sticks out and is interesting, has a different tone to everything else, has made some unusual choices, is novel, will always kind of stick in my memory. So when I'm going back and actually sort of voting stuff up and down, that stuff always has an advantage because it's kind of stuck out in my memory. I guess I'm looking for did they do everything the brief asked them to do? As in, like, sometimes a brief will say, we want, it is a copywriting brief, and we want to see 3 different types of out of home poster. And if you haven't done, if that's a mandatory that's set in the brief and you haven't fulfilled those, anything else you've done is almost irrelevant. You know, if the brief has sort of mandated something, you should do it. Um, and then I'm just kind of like looking for entries that are kind of written in kind of a like an engaging and persuasive way. Which is maybe that speaks to me as a strategist. Like other judges, I think will look for other things. But you know, that's broadly speaking. I think standing out, being original, is probably the thing that's going to get you noticed. And I appreciate it's a fine line, isn't it? Because on the one hand, I'm saying understand the brief, make sure you're on brief, and on the other hand, I'm saying be original. And sometimes people get that wrong. Sometimes in the quest for originality, they almost bin the brief. And I think you just got to use your, answer those 5 questions. Make sure you've got your pieces. Make sure you can kind of show the judges how you're relating back to the brief, and make sure any kind of things you do to move it on are purposeful and choiceful in that you can explain them. And I think you'll be in good shape. And don't ignore mandatories. It's a tall order, but like I said at the start, a pencil is precious. So it's not easy.
Amazing. I think that's all we've got time for today. So I just want to say a big thank you to Fadi for this amazing session. It was really insightful, and I'm sure everyone got so much out of it.